Welcome back. In this session, we will now talk about the concrete management of the urban electricity utility. And this is generally done historically by an electricity managing utility, which is integrated and operates the grid as well as the selling of the electricity. In most of the countries, this utility is standing alone, but in some countries, it's the same utility that also manages the gas, the water, the cables, and sometimes even urban public transport. The utility is generally traditionally a public entity owned by the municipalities. As of recently, with liberalization, with market-based approach, some of the activities have been outsourced to private operators, especially electricity selling and purchasing, but we will see that. Now, what I will do concretely here is to proceed in 4 steps. So what are the major managing tasks in operations and management of the grid, the urban electricity grid, in terms of grid development, in terms of customer relations, and in terms of energy purchasing? Let's first talk about the grid. The biggest challenge that urban electricity infrastructure managers confront is the challenge of balancing demand and supply. You know that electricity cannot be stored. That means there needs always to be the same amount of electricity being fed into the grid as being consumed. So the big challenge is to make that balance. If there is too much electricity, there is a blackout. If there is not enough electricity, there is a blackout. That's the big challenge. This challenge is exacerbated by self-generation. Okay, so you all know that electricity is not consumed in the same amount. There are peak hours during the day. There is more electricity than there is produced, and that creates an imbalance at some certain peak hours during lunchtime, during evening time. All this balancing activity is exacerbated by self-generation, which has to be factored in when balancing the electricity, and it's further exacerbated by intermittency. That means, especially if you produce with renewable energies, of course, solar energy cannot really be planned as well. Solar electricity production cannot be planned as well as nuclear electricity production, which can be clearly forecasted. So intermittency, renewables, all this exacerbates the balancing challenge that urban electricity managers have. And some of this actually requires grid reinforcement. Historically, the electricity grid is a top-down grid. You go from high voltage to medium low voltage to low voltage to consumers. But with self-generation, actually consumers also produce, and therefore you need to plan grid reinforcement. And that helps me to make the link to the next big challenge, which is the grid development. Especially in the case of rapidly growing cities, let's say you add a new city, a part of the city, 10,000 new inhabitants or 50,000 new inhabitants. You need to develop new connections. This needs to be planned. The electricity needs to be brought to these new areas without destabilizing the rest of the urban electricity grid. Grid development is especially a challenge for planning. I mean, you cannot put these grids in overnight. So you need to plan. You need to buy to ensure the financing, and this is really the next big steps. And often the financing of the traditional grid activities is not sufficient in order to generate the money to roll out new grids to totally new areas. So you have to, as a manager, you have to make sure that you get the finances to develop the electricity grid. We have talked about public-private partnerships, but alternatives are also to have the developers of these new cities contribute to the financing of the electricity grid. A new big management challenge. The third big management challenge pertains, of course, to the customers, the way you relate to the customers. Electricity must be metered, measured, and then billed to the customers. That's how ultimately the utility makes its money. So it better make sure that it is correctly metered in order, for example, to avoid complaint by the customers, which have to be handled, and that's time consuming and annoying. And of course, they have to be built correctly in time, not too late, so as to generate the money that is required. There are several more challenges here in terms of customer relations. There are non-paying customers or customers that are paying too late. At some point, you have to decide as an electricity manager whether you want to hook them off the grid or not, whether that will cause you problems, whether that is even politically allowed or not, whether you want to offer paying plans to the non-paying customers. But this is a big issue because hooking off customers has also a cost. There are things in some countries, more rather in emerging countries and developing countries, known as electricity theft. People hook onto the electricity grid before the meter and actually consume electricity without paying for it. Can be an important factor, which of course results in revenue loss, but also it results in loss of predictability when you try to balance the electricity system. This must of course be addressed. And in some cities, in some countries, you actually have social tariffs in the sense that some customers do not pay the same amount of money for the same amount of electricity consumed. And this has to be handled. Social tariffs are awfully ordered for political reasons. They will result in a revenue loss for the electricity operator, but the operator then has to go after the political authorities to make sure that he is being compensated for the social tariffs he is forced to offer. Now, the fourth big management task pertains to purchasing of electricity. As I have already said, that the city is generally not producing its own electricity. It's buying it from somewhere. And it is important, as you understand, that it makes the right buying decisions. And this buying traditionally happens by way of contract. You are contracting with a producer. We have seen that in the session before. But this carries risk. You may have the wrong contract. You may buy electricity too expensively when later it becomes cheaper. So buying the electricity, purchasing the electricity that is needed for a whole city is actually a complex managerial task, which increasingly is made more complex because now you also have power exchanges, traders, as we have seen before. You can buy from them. You may get actually a better price buying from traders, but at the same time, this carries more risks. In other words, electricity purchasing is becoming a big managerial activity of a local electricity utility. Now, we have seen previously, in previous blocks and sessions, we have talked about the main dimensions of managing urban infrastructure systems. So balancing would rather be a technical task, pertain to the technical dimension of management, The whole grid development rather pertain to technical and economic dimensions. The managing the customers pertains to social and political dimensions. And the whole purchasing, of course, pertains to economic and also to environmental dimensions. For example, in the case where you are trying to buy green energy, green electricity, because this is something that your customers may require. In this session, I have basically talked about the four main management functions. And these pertain, very simplistically, they pertain to the grid, the development of the grid, the maintenance of the grid, the operations of the grid, and then they pertain to the way to the energy itself, to the electricity itself, the customers that consume it, the traders, the sellers, the producers of the electricity that produce it. These are both big management tasks of urban electricity managers. Now, these functions will evolve, and we will see this in the next session. These functions will evolve because there are new challenges. What I have described before now is basically a relatively static view, but there are new challenges in the horizon, like climate change, like information and communication technologies we have talked about. And these challenges may actually also be new opportunities for urban electricity infrastructure managers. Stay tuned.